I'm John Travis here in Mullumbimby with Helen Caldecott down in, say the name of your town again?
Very.
Barry, yes, I looked it up. I have known of you for 45 years, and you're the first person I've interviewed that I haven't personally met. So we're breaking new ground. I've done about 45 interviews of
Yes.
the planned 250, and delighted that you are available and in the same time zone, which is nice.
Yes.
And we go back, actually, you were in Boston the same years I was at Tufts Medical from 65 to 69. So I used to come over to the Countway, the brand new library that the ceiling leaked and you'd hear the water drops 5 stories into the buckets on rainy days. But let's go back to your origins. I know you were born in Melbourne, and tell me a little bit about how you came into the world and how that shaped your eventual path.
Yeah, I was born in Melbourne in 1938, and we lived in Melbourne until we moved to Adelaide when I was 15, because Dad got a job in Adelaide. I went to primary school, just the state school. And then I went to Fintona, which was a wonderful private girls' school, run by a wonderful woman called Margaret Cunningham, who really shaped my life. She would come in to take a class on religious instruction with a box of matches and cigarettes in one hand and a Bible in the other. And we'd talk about comparative religions, and she was extraordinary. Anyway, when I was 15, we left and went to Adelaide. I went to a horrible school there called Wilderness for 2 terms, and then I went to Unley High, which was fantastic. I fell in love with my French teacher called Michael Bradley, and we had a kind of affair. And then when the authorities found out, he was transferred to Udnadatta, and then he left and became one of the greatest philosophers in the world, according to Laurie Smart, who is a professor of philosophy at Adelaide University. His son, James Bradley, now is a major writer. He's obviously inherited his father's brilliance. Anyway, I finished Unley High. I got a Commonwealth Scholarship. When I was 11, I decided to be a doctor. And asked me why, because I was going to be a teacher. And at the time, I said, I never, ever deviated from that. I just loved medicine. Anyway, so I entered medical school at Adelaide. I came second in final year, which was quite nice, and second in second year medicine. Never thought I was particularly intelligent, but I kind of realized in later life that I probably was. And then, of course,
let me pause for a minute. We're having some audio problems. It's dropping out some of your sentences, and I don't know that we can fix it, but I may ask you to repeat a sentence if it garbled, just for the recording. This is an informal recording, and the one I did the other day with Bill Manahan was terrible, but that's the best we could do with his internet. So anyway, if I have to ask you to repeat, it's not because I can't understand, it's the internet.
Okay, so I shall do. Yep.
Med school and
I just loved it. I loved every minute of medical school. Just loved it. And I love being a doctor. It's like being a nun, it's my vocation.
So, and then you went into pediatrics, but first you went to Boston then.
Well, we went to Boston. I was pregnant with my 3rd baby. I had 3 babies in 3 years. I loved having babies. And Bill was offered a job at Boston Children's Hospital in the radiology department under Ed Newhouser, a brilliant pediatric radiologist. And we couldn't afford to have a baby in Boston. So I said, look, you go, and for the last 3 months of my pregnancy, I'll stay with Mum. And I had the baby, and 5 months after he left, I took the whole shebang, 3 children under 3, a mother who was actually dying of rheumatoid lung disease, to Boston. It was an extraordinary effort on my part. And when we got to Boston, it was all fine, but I got a bit bored and I said, look, can you get me a part-time job at Harvard? And so Bill met Harry Schwachman walking along the corridor, beetling along the corridor with his psoriasis, etc. And he was one of the pioneers in cystic fibrosis. And so Harry said he'd give me a part-time job, and so I worked there for 3 years. And I learned how to treat kids with CF.
I'm going to have to have you repeat
it was wonderful.
That all garbled, the last two sentences. Oh dear. Can you remember?
Yeah, Bill, is it working now?
Yeah, he got you the job with cystic fibrosis, but then after that.
Okay. And I worked there for, I think 18 months, and I learned how to treat children with CF. And being at Harvard was spectacular. It was like being in the Louvre, or, I mean, just incredible. That, you know, the people who'd written all the monograms in pediatrics were there on the staff. It was just extraordinary. And a medical student would stand up during grand rounds and say, you're wrong, to Charlie Janeway, who was the chief of pediatrics at Children's Hospital, a much revered man. And Charlie would say, why? Whereas in Adelaide, the Children's Hospital, everyone was up themselves and you dare not criticize any of your teachers. Anyway, it was marvelous. And when I got back to Adelaide, my mother died just before I got back, and I became profoundly, deeply depressed for 2 years. I was really, really depressed, really terrible, terrible sickness it is. Anyway, I went to the Adelaide Children's Hospital, and the attitude there was that children with a fatal genetic disease, the sooner they died, the better. And I said, but I know how to treat these children. And they said, who do you think you are? You don't even have a membership. You're not even a pediatrician. So I said to Bill, well, I've looked after the kids while you did your training in pediatrics. He was then chief of radiology, now at the Adelaide Children's Hospital. So you look after kids, I'll go back and be an RMO, work 80 hours a week, and do the membership, which is a really hard exam. You know, they fail 2/3. So I worked like mad. I loved it. And at the end of the time, I got the membership, and I said, well, where's the clinic? And the senior pediatrician said, we don't believe in luxury clinics. What they meant was a luxury clinic for the pediatrician, not the patients. So we got out the actuarial numbers, but comparing Adelaide Children's Hospital mortality rates with the whole of North America. And our children died at an average age of 4, in North America 17. So another guy called Graham Vimpani, who helped me do this, and I presented this at Grand Rounds, and we got the clinic. And I had 6 months to set up before I left for a sabbatical in Boston again. You know, that meant getting nutritionists, Miss 10 specialists, physiotherapists, pharmacy people, the whole thing. I had, I think, 60 patients. I got them all organized. I taught another physician how to treat them. And now that clinic has the best results, longevity results in Australia. It was the first CF clinic in Australia. Wow. Meanwhile, at the time, when I was an RMO working 80 hours a week, I found out the French were testing bombs in the Pacific, and that the radiation levels in the Adelaide water supply were quite high. So I wrote a letter to the Advertiser, the local paper, saying children, you know, these isotopes like strontium-90 and cesium would concentrate in milk, etc. Children could get cancer and leukemia from the test by concentrating in food. And it wasn't published. Well, I just read Germaine Greer, which helped me out my depression. And I rang the editor and said, where's my letter? And he said, well, madam, we get hundreds a day. And I said, yeah, but mine's important. And I talked him through it, and he published the letter. Well, that night I was invited by the ABC to be on This Day Tonight, with Helen, and that's when it took off. He said he shot the fish, blew up another bomb. I was on television. Remember, I was still working 80 hours a week. And the hospital got more calls about French tests than they did about the patients.
Wow.
And the medical superintendent called me into his office and threatened me with my job. And I said, well, are my patients suffering? And he said, no. So anyway, and what I didn't know was Australians don't like the French. They think they're arrogant. Well, they are. I've got a French son-in-law who's a count. And so in 9 months, 75% of Australians rose up and said, we won't have these bloody French testing their bloody bombs in the Pacific. They stopped buying French cheese. They wouldn't deliver French wine. They stopped buying French cheese, the whole thing. Mail, they wouldn't deliver French mail. And so, who later became Prime Minister, and the New Zealand Prime Minister took France to the International Court of Justice, so they were forced out. So I realised that Dixon, Jefferson said, an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. Absolute. I mean, there were whole pages of letters to the editor about the bloody French. No one's ever seen anything like it in Australia before.
Wow.
So
I missed it. Garbled. Who was the Australian Prime Minister?
Gough Whitlam.
Oh, him. Good. Yeah.
But meanwhile, at the end of that 9 month period, I was invited to go to Tahiti to meet with the French, with a delegation of people. And then they forbade us to land. So the next minute I'm on a plane off to Paris with Jim Cairns, who was then to become the Deputy Prime Minister, and me and the union. We went to Elysee Palace and we met with them, and they said, our bombs are perfectly safe. So Jim said, well, why don't you test them in the Mediterranean?
Yeah.
And they blanched and said, oh, there are too many people living around the Mediterranean. So for the first time in my rather innocent life, I was face to face with wicked politicians who didn't give one damn if kids died of leukemia from their tests.
Wow.
That was a big lesson. Yeah.
But
Anyway.
That one letter started the whole ball rolling.
That's right.
And they didn't even want to publish it.
No.
That really got your activism off to a start.
Well, 2 years later, after I set up the clinic, and I found out that Gough Whitlam, our now Prime Minister, wanted to mine uranium. I knew nothing about uranium, so I went to the Bar Smith Library at Adelaide University, and I got out a book called Poison Power by Goffman and Tamplin. Plutonium. Brilliant man. He was commissioned by the Atomic Energy Commission to work out what the medical dangers of nuclear power might be. And it was a brilliant book. I mean, such that I almost developed alopecia as I was reading it, with my hair falling out. And so I thought, oh shit, we can't export uranium. So I went to see Gough in Parliament House. He wasn't a bit interested. I wrote letters to the paper, that didn't work. And then I knew a union man, an engine driver. And he said, look, let's write to all the unions in Australia. And at that time, there were 76 unions in South Australia. And, there were numerous unions. Can I come and talk to you about the medical effects of mining uranium? They said, yes, but we need the jobs. So then I started off, I went to Darwin, speaking to men at 6 a.m. in the morning before they went out on their rounds, on a dirt floor with a dirty old blackboard, drawing sperm, testicles, genes, mutations, the like. And I got around speaking to unions all over the country. I finally ended up at the Trades and Labour Council in Adelaide. I had 10 minutes to speak. At the end, they rang a bell which nearly knocked me off the platform. I was quite good looking at that time, premenopausal. And talk.
That whole last sentence got garbled. I'm
Okay.
going to hold up my hand when it's garbling, and
Okay.
then
I went to the Trades and Labour Council in Adelaide to talk to them about uranium mining. I had 10 minutes. That obviously were well lubricated and had drunk a lot of beer before I started. And for the first 5 minutes, they talked loudly through my talk. And I started talking about them.
it's okay now.
I started talking about the medical effect of radiation upon their testicles. Well, that shut them up. So, so I had then 5 minutes to really bring the whole thing together. And at
So
the
you
end,
literally had them by their balls.
yeah, by their balls. And so it always works. So at the end of my talk, they said, oh, we don't want our children growing up in a world like that. So they sent a telegram to Gough Whitlam. Well, the end result was, and then I had to leave for America for the sabbatical. The Trades and Labour Council, which was the major council of trade unions in Australia, passed a resolution that they would need uranium.
They would need what for uranium?
They would neither mine, transport, nor export uranium. So the whole thing came to a, yeah. And that, once again, it was purely education.
Yeah.
Till bloody Bob Hawke got into power. Nasty little man. I once tried to talk to him about uranium mining and he propositioned me, which is where he was. Anyway, when he got into power, he said he brought in the 3 mine policy. Well, we'll just have 3 uranium mines. Well, it's like telling a patient, well, don't worry, dear, you're just a little bit pregnant.
Yeah.
So he totally destroyed that. But that was another victory, just purely by education and being a doctor. As one educates one's patients, one educates the public about the medical effect. And since that time, I've really always practiced global preventive medicine.
Mm-hmm. And that's what touched me when I first heard about PSR back there in, I think it was 78. Rick and Grassi was out from Boston and he told us it was a meeting we were having and signed me up. And then, so now, how were you doing? You weren't doing your 80 hours a week still with the pediatrics at that point?
That was only through the French tests.
Oh, okay.
And then I set up the cystic fibrosis clinic. Then we went to America for a year. Then I came back and did the uranium process, the anti-uranium campaign. And we got to the end of that. Then what? Then we were offered permanent jobs at Harvard, Bill and I. So we immigrated to America to work at Harvard. I was an instructor in pediatrics and I worked in the cystic fibrosis clinic with wonderful, wonderful people. Bill worked in the radiology department and we lived in Boston for years, 20 years.
I'm curious where you were living. I might even know the neighborhood.
1445 Commonwealth Avenue, West Newton.
Oh, yeah.
The house with 9 bathrooms.
Wow.
Which we got for a song and it's still there. It's a beautiful old brick house. I
just rode by there last summer on the bus when we were
there you go. Yeah.
Didn't know how significant it was.
Where are you from originally?
Ohio, which is a good place to be from. Went to med school in Boston and it was a little too, the Boston Brahmins and we Midwestern WAFs didn't get along so well. So I fled to California and transplanted myself to the San Francisco Bay Area. But I have an appreciation. It was fun to go back and visit Boston last summer and see the transformation. So now when does PSR come into this? There's still probably a few years.
Oh yeah, now what happened? I knew a doctor, I can't remember his name, Boardman, lovely man, Boardman, who knew Arnold Relman, who was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine.
Right.
And he asked me to dinner to meet Arnold. Well, I actually forgot. I'd fed the family. I was doing the ironing and the phone rang. So we rushed like mad out. And by that time, they'd all had a few martinis and stuff. And Arnold Relman asked me then to write an article for the New England Journal of Medicine on the medical dangers of nuclear power. So I spent a year in the Countway Library going through writing my article. And the best information I got was from the Journal of Health Physics. They were physicists who were writing about the health of their employees. I wrote the article, which was a very good article, actually. I submitted it, and when it went to peer review, the peer said, well, you didn't say anything good about nuclear power. And I said, medically, there's nothing good. I should have contested it with Relman, and I didn't. I got pretty depressed, and then I lost the article when I left Harvard. I left it in a drawer. It was a damn good article. Anyway, I was then asked to give a speech at a house just near our house in Commonwealth Avenue to a group of people, and there was a man called Nahum Stiskin there who had a publishing house, and he said, will you write a book? And I said, no, I can't write a book. And he said, well, talk into a microphone. Well, Nuclear Madness, which sold like crazy and came out just before 3 Mile Island.
Wow.
Yeah, the serendipity. And at that time, I met with Ira Health, and Ira was a young doctor working at the hospital in Cambridge, and there was a referendum on nuclear, all things nuclear in Cambridge, which was difficult because Harvard does a lot of nuclear work, MIT has a reactor, but it was an impediment. And I'd just written the article, you see, and Ira knew about me. We talked, and I said to Ira, you know, this is a medical problem. Let's start a medical organisation. It turned out that PSR had existed in the early 60s. They did work on, they wrote 2 very important articles on a bomb dropping on Boston for the New England Journal of Medicine. They followed the baby tooth campaign measuring strontium-90 in teeth with Barry Commoner, etc. But it had died. They'd fought. It was not moribund, it was dead. But there were the articles of registration still in Massachusetts. So we were able to use them and create a new organisation. Problem with the older people. And so we started PSR. And I remember taking an advertisement about the medical dangers of nuclear power to the New England Journal of Medicine that I'd put together. And it was published the day after 3 Mile Island melted down. It was serendipity.
Wow.
And you can't imagine, we were operating out of a little shoe cupboard in someone's practice in Harvard Square, where we were deluged with members, and that was the beginning of it. And then we started doing symposia on the medical effects of nuclear war and describing bombs dropping on a city, etc. And at medical schools throughout the country, and they were just so popular. And we had, you know, we ended up with what? 125 chapters and 32,000 members. And we led the campaign and the debate against nuclear weapons. And from our activities spawned psychologists against war, architects against nuclear war, historians against nuclear war. I even was invited to the annual Morticians Association meeting. I said, well, why do you want me to talk to you? And they said, we don't want to have to embalm radioactive bodies. And I said, don't worry, you'll be one yourself. Passed a resolution against nuclear war. And I got to speak to the Southern Baptists, to the Mormons, because, you know, you can just quote Jesus to the Christians, or, you know, and And then a woman heard me talk in Los Angeles at the symposium, and she came up to me. She was an agent who represented Tom Cruise, Sally Field, Lily Tomlin, and everyone. She said, I want to work with you. And I said, I can't afford you. She said, I'll work with you for free. So then she got me in Vogue, Life, Time, Family Circle, Ladies' Home Journal, Donahue, Griffin, this, you know, all the television shows. So through Pat Kingsley, I was able to educate the majority of Americans about the dangers of nuclear war. And because of that, we got 1 million people in Central Park, the largest march ever in the history of America.
I remember that.
Protesting nuclear war. I had 3 minutes to talk to this ocean of faces. So I didn't know what, so I dropped the bomb on them. Melted their eyeballs, you know, I mean. And my quote was the quote of the week in the New York Times, which was a Nixon quote: don't listen to what we say, watch what we do. Anyway, I mean, it was quite extraordinary, and we were winning. We were beating the military-industrial complex. Gorbachev then heard our doctor's talk on television in Russia. I met his daughter at the Playboy Mansion where I was invited to talk, and Patty Davis, his daughter, came up and said, I think you could convince my father, would you see him? And I said, yes, but alone. I don't want Miss Baker or Diva there. I want to, anyway. So I got an hour and a quarter with Reagan alone. Patty sat there but said nothing. And he got very uptight, very anxious. He virtually knew nothing. So I sort of established a doctor-patient relationship with him and held his hand for half the time to reassure him, because he got a malar flush when he got anxious. And I thought, well, his IQ is about 100. I came out and said he's got impending Alzheimer's, which was a correct diagnosis.
Yeah.
But after that, and then the film came out the day after, which was a bomb dropping on a Midwestern city, and it was very powerful. He saw that. And that was brought about by PSR activities and the doctors. And so after that, Reagan started to say nuclear war must never be fought and can never be won. He then worked with Gorbachev. They met in Reykjavik. And two mere males almost agreed to abolish nuclear weapons, but they got hung up on Star Wars or missile defense. Reagan sort of thought it was a big sort of plastic shiny dome over America, and the Russians boink, 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 bounce off. Gorbachev knew it would never work, but he didn't want to agree to it. So unfortunately, they didn't abolish nuclear weapons, which was the most amazing situation to think that actually I started the thing with my own naivety, saying that if all the doctors got together, we can teach the Americans about the medical effects of nuclear war, which we did. I said, even the president has a doctor. Not sure if we did. But so being a doctor, practicing preventive medicine, adhering to the Hippocratic Oath, teaching preventive medicine, we were able to move the whole country towards nuclear disarmament. And it failed because Reagan was hung up on Star Wars. And that is the tragedy of my life. Now they're building more weapons. It's just out of hand. And I want written on my tombstone, she tried, and she failed. And that's the tragedy of my life. And I'm 81. It's just to think we got so close.
Wow. Well, and it'd probably be a lot worse if you hadn't done that.
Well, people say I saved the earth, I stopped nuclear war, and who knows, because we didn't have one anyway, so we don't know. We don't know, but
Yeah.
yeah, well, we wouldn't have the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. We wouldn't have a lot of things. And after they met, and the Cold War came to an end and the Berlin Wall came down, America started talking about peace dividends, using the money, $1 trillion a year spent on death and killing, peace dividends, fix the roads, fix the building, fix the healthcare, etc. But the military industrial complex didn't like that. And they moved in pretty voraciously and changed the whole thing, enlarged NATO right up to the border of Russia, which European countries joined NATO. And to join NATO, they had to buy, $3 billion worth of weapons. And now America's got missiles right along the border of Russia, threatening Russia. Imagine if Russia had missiles on the border of Canada, threatening America. America would blow up the world. What?
We saw what happened with Cuba.
Exactly.
Yeah.
America would blow up the world. So, I know so much. If I was on television now, like I was then, I could once again teach the American people, but A, I'm 81, B, I'm not beautiful like I was premenopausal, which, see, I've still got the Australian accent, and Americans think I'm probably English, and they quite revere the English accent. That was useful. Anyway, it's too late now, and I'll be dead soon. So it's just, I can say, a fucking tragedy.
Yeah. Well, but you did your part. You did a lot.
Yeah, but I don't care. It's like losing a patient. You just,
yeah.
You understand.
Yeah.
It's the planet. Will we end with a whimper or a bang? And I've written 12 books, I think. And one book I wrote 20 years ago, If You Love This Planet, the first 2 chapters are all about global warming. And everything I wrote and the scientists predicted has come to pass.
Yeah.
And I used to think, well, everyone will read this and they'll fix it.
Yeah, right.
That's arrogant. Anyway, c'est la vie. That's the story.
Well, wow, I'm still digesting. I didn't know all of the background with Reagan and Gorbachev and that whole scene.
I met with Trudeau and had lunch with him, convinced him to do the 5-continent, 6-nation peace initiative. I met with the leader of the Mormon Church, an old man of 95, because Reagan wanted to put the MX missile on trains in Utah. And I convinced him that wasn't a good idea. He cancelled that, so that never happened. I used to visit 3 cities a day, addressing audiences of maybe 3,000. And at night I couldn't sleep, always trying to think about how to prevent nuclear war.
Yeah. Now we have another friend in common, Jeff Patterson, who.
Darling Jeff, yeah.
How did you and Jeff get?
Well, he was in PSR, of course.
Yeah.
And one of the symposia I organized at the New York Academy of Medicine was on the risk of nuclear war and AI, artificial intelligence, controlling the weapons. And Stephen Hawking had written an article saying how dangerous this was. So I thought, oh my God. So I organized a symposium. Was that? No, it wasn't that one. It was another symposium just after Fukushima. And I invited all the physicists, medical doctors understanding it. And Jeff was there. And Jeff organized at lunchtime a meeting with the sailors who were on that ship that went to try and help people at Fukushima, and they got terribly, terribly irradiated. And so he organized a meeting at lunchtime and a press conference. I went out to where Jeff lives. Where did he live? In the Midwest somewhere?
Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah, to give I think Grand Rounds or something. And I had been with my grandson in Boston, and my son insisted that I lift Liam up and change his napkin and stuff. and my hands were so sore, so arthritic, painful. Jeff sweetly took me into his house and injected saline into the joints, and the symptoms went away. He implied that, you know, they kicked me out of PSR because I was arrogant. I said, Jeff, I'm not arrogant. So he brought the line because they did kick me out of PSR. I think it was orchestrated by the CIA, but I'm not sure. So I convinced Jeff that I was not arrogant. And when he died, I was just so devastated.
Yeah, that was so unexpected.
Oh, awful.
Yeah, he was on his way. They were doing what he was doing with was called prolotherapy, of injecting joints.
Yeah.
And he did my back, and they would go down. He trained doctors in that down in Central America.
Yeah.
And he and his wife were taking medical supplies and school supplies and doing wonderful work down there. And I think he was actually on his first vacation in many years in the city when they were due to fly out to the Caribbean or something when he died that night.
I know.
Yeah. So, yeah. But he was president for a number of years. I know he went to Chernobyl several times and Fukushima. And
I didn't know that. I wouldn't go to those places.
Yeah. He
a lovely man. So how come you ended up in Mullumbimby when you are an American?
Well, I married an Australian 40 years ago, and we lived in the States for 20 years, and we had a daughter. And when she was 7, we decided to try out Australia, and first lived in East Gippsland, and that was pretty conservative. And then there was a woman up here in Mullumbimby publishing a magazine on, it's called Byron Child, about attachment parenting, and her interests were environmental as well. But she realized that even if we save the forests or whatever, the next generation will just chop them down if we don't raise connected children. And the big problem is disconnection. My 6-word summary of my whole career is the currency of wellness is connection. And connection begins in infancy or in the uterus with, it's not just a lump, it's a living conscious being. And so I moved into infant wellness, and Kali Wendorf is her name. I had her come to a seminar we did in California, and I asked her, what's this Mullumbimby? I couldn't even pronounce it. She said, well, come on up and visit. So we did, and bought a house on that same trip, and love living here. I avoid winter by living here half the year, and then in Northern California the other half. So I've got the best of both places, Marin County and Mullumbimby.
Absolutely.
You've been here, I trust, or Byron? Or?
Oh, absolutely. I lived in Byron Bay for about 5 years, bought a gorgeous house.
Oh, when was that?
Just after my husband left me on my 50th birthday.
Oh, boy.
1980, maybe?
Oh, well before.
With a view of Mount Warning. It was just, so I lived in Byron Bay for quite a long time, and my son moved to the university there in Lismore. It was I love Byron Bay. And then to my dishonor, I joined a cult because I was very vulnerable, and cults pour love on you. So lonely, and it was a stupid move. And they moved down to Warrigal in Gippsland. Horrible. Looking at one.
Say that again. They moved to Warrigal and then it garbled.
And Warrigal, and then I sold my house and moved down with them.
Oh, what was the cult?
I'm an idiot. Yeah.
What was the name of it?
All One Voice.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, when I was in Byron, I spent a lot of time in Mullumbimby, and my daughter, did you write to Penny? She said she thought you did.
I did, yes. Uh-huh.
Well, you'd love Pen, and she's got a lot of friends in Mullumbimby and goes up there quite often.
Well, we'll have to meet up. Yeah, great.
You really have to meet up. Yeah, you'd get on with it like a house on fire.
Yeah, I see she's near Gosford, which is where I had a kidney stone 2 years ago. So I know the Gosford Hospital.
All right.
They were wonderful. I was in and out in a couple hours and
Oh,
really
great.
impressed. So she's your middle child, right? You
She
have a
is.
son
She's,
and a younger daughter?
she's my middle child. My first is Philip, named after my beloved father, who died at the age of 51 in 3 weeks of an anaplastic induced by asbestos, because he built 2 houses out of asbestos.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I helped him. I used to help hold the sheets as he sawed, and I'm still here. Philip is a nurturer, and he's worked in the best restaurants in the world. He had a restaurant in Bellingen for 3 years, but he became very anxious, and now he's head of a unit at TAFE in Coffs Harbour, teaching people hospitality. A lot of Indigenous people he's working with, and he absolutely loves it. He married a really fine person who was got 2 kids, champions. So that's Philip. And then my youngest is William. He's in Boston, environmental science at Lismore, the university there. But now he is in a firm that cleans up toxic waste. That's endless. He lives in Newton, where he grew up.
Oh.
He married a woman he knew as a little boy, Heather Friedman, because we knew the Friedmans just up the road, and they've got 2 kids. One is Claire, who had a bat mitzvah, and one is Liam, who's 10, who's got red hair.
Hey, Garble, he's got what? Liam has
Red
what?
hair like my father.
Oh, okay.
And he's so beautiful, I can eat him.
So you have those 2 grandsons and then other grandkids?
Yeah, I've got 7 grandchildren.
Wow.
In fact, here's a picture of them.
Oh, okay. They're pretty good sized for the most part.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a wonderful getting to know you, and I'm sorry that the audio was so frustrating, but I think people will be able to understand. There'd be like a couple sentences, but it'll be a test, and I don't know what we can do about it. It's just a problem with Australian internets are not that viable. Are there any other things that you'd like to add to our viewers?
No, I think what we've done is nicely rounded. I mean, I could talk till the cows come home, but I think what we've done is fine.
Yes.
And I'd like to meet you one day, Jack.
Well, certainly, yeah. And
are you still with your wife?
I'm with a new partner as of 8 years. My work has been around how having children destroys most marriages, and we were writing a book about that topic when our daughter left home, and I realized that our relationship had left home.
Oh.
At age 68, I fell madly in love, and the last 8 years I've had a most wonderful, the teenage years I missed. So,
that's nice.
We're going steady. We exchanged rings last July.
Nice.
She won't marry me. But anyway, my daughter is down in Sydney. It's 26, and another daughter with 2 grandchildren up in California. So I see them pretty regularly. But the efforts of, our paths of preventive medicine, that's what my residency was at Johns Hopkins. And it was the preventive medicine department at Tufts that actually inspired me to I couldn't give drugs. It just didn't seem right to be giving drugs to people, and can do so much more with some prevention. So,
well, you and Penny would get on like a house on fire. That's for sure.
Well,
that's great.
Thank you again, and we'll be in touch.
My great pleasure, Jack.
Bye.
Bye.